I got a request recently for a sermon on angels. And that is a subject that is sure to inspire absolutely no controversy or speculation whatsoever, because nobody ever says things about angels that can't be substantiated. But in this lesson, I decided to kind of go about it through the back door and a roundabout way. Because angels are a subject ripe for speculation, and while the Bible tells us quite a bit about them, they're still shrouded in mystery and prone to misunderstanding for some reason. But what I would really like to talk about this morning, I called the lesson Angelic Destroyers. And if you see the bulletin, you'll see that that's the title I gave it. Because there's two things you need to know coming into this. First, in virtually every passage in the Bible that mentions angels, angels themselves are never the point of the text. They're usually incidental to the story. They're a means to an end at some point. But there's no systematic explanation anywhere in the Bible of what they are. There's no chapter in the Bible that says, okay, now here's what angels are made out of, and here's the different jobs that they're employed in doing, and all that. That chapter's not in the Bible. And secondly, the other thing you need to know, number two, angels are terrifying. Do not believe the popular media image, the image crafted and constructed by the greeting card companies of this cute little baby with the wings and the halo who's designed with the big goo-goo eyes that's designed to make you feel good about them. That is not what angels are. There's a difference between the pop art angel that makes you go, aww, and the real angels in the Bible that make everybody scream in terror. Every single time that an angel in the Bible appears to a human, it strikes fear into their hearts. Look at Isaiah chapter 6, for instance. Isaiah says that in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim, a type of angel, stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds trembled at the voice of him who called out while the temple was filling with smoke. And then I said, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. It is a terrifying sight to behold. Not just the angels, which is the only real thing in the text that Isaiah describes, but also the Lord, who is so terrifying that Isaiah doesn't even tell you what he looks like. In Daniel chapter 10, an angel appears to Daniel, and how does Daniel react? Let's look at this vision here. In Daniel chapter 10, in verses 1, beginning in verse 1, it says that in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar, and the message was true and one of great conflict. But he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were completed. On the 24th day of the 1st month, while I was by the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. His body also was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. This does not look like anything you've ever seen in your Hallmark greeting cards. Now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. They couldn't even see the angel, and they were scared of it. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. He fainted, in other words. And then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees, and he said to me, Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words that I am about to tell you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. And when he spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling, And he said to me, do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. And then he goes on to describe the rest of the vision, which we're not going to touch on at this point. Every time angels appear, people are terrified. In the fields, when the shepherds are watching their sheep by night, and the angels appear to them to announce that Jesus has been born, what is the first thing they say? Do not be afraid. Why? Because there's something to be afraid of. Angels are terrifying. In Matthew chapter 28, when the women come to the empty tomb where Jesus has been buried, and the angels have descended from heaven and rolled away the stone from the tomb, the soldiers, the crack Roman troops, have run away in fear at the sight of the angels. And when the women see the angels, they have to tell the women, do not be afraid. Among other things. On and on we can go. Angels are terrifying. Why are they terrifying? It's not just that they're terrifying, though. It's that they are destroyers. Angels can do a lot of damage in a relatively short space of time. And so what I would like to do this morning is I would like to look at some stories in the Bible that talk about some rather terrifying things that angels do, and then make a basic point of application. Let's rewind to the Exodus. Go back to Exodus chapter 12. And just to kind of give us some context for this, in the book of Exodus, Israel has been enslaved in Egypt for centuries. And in this generation, they had cried out to the Lord for deliverance from bondage. And Moses and Aaron were sent to Pharaoh with one basic request. Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. They say that this is a message from Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, let my people go. But guess what? Pharaoh had never heard of Yahweh. So he said, who is Yahweh? Who is the Lord that I should listen to his voice? And at that question, the Lord set him up with a 10-lesson correspondence course. God sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians to tell Pharaoh who he was. One plague after another. And each time it looked like Pharaoh was going to recant. The Lord took away the plague, and then, well, he recanted his recantation. Moses said in chapter 5 and verse 3, let us go where God will fall on us with pestilence. But the real pestilence falls on the Egyptians, doesn't it? Pestilence and sword, plagues and defeat fall on the Egyptians instead of Israel. And initially Pharaoh refuses. He says, no, I'm not going to let the people go. Why would I give up all this cheap labor? So Pharaoh makes his own demands. He tells people to build bricks without straw, heightening the oppression, heightening the policy of the beginning of Exodus. But as the plagues start to come, as the water turns to blood and the frogs jump on everyone and the flies and the bugs and the dead livestock begin to pile up, Pharaoh starts to sort of cave a little bit. First he tells the people, well, you can worship in the land. And Moses says, that's not going to work. The Egyptians would stone us for that. He says, well, you can go, but don't go far. You can't go the full distance into the wilderness. But that doesn't work either. Well, you can go, but you have to leave your women and your children here. In chapter 10. In chapter 10 and verse 24, well, you can go, but you have to leave your stuff behind, your cattle and your livestock. No, that's not good enough either, because we have to sacrifice to the Lord. Finally, Pharaoh caves at the end of chapter 12 and says, just leave. Pharaoh makes a series of false promises in the stories. A request for supplication over the frogs. A false promise over the flies. He confesses sin when hail destroys the crops. But then he recants his confession. He confesses sin out of fear of the locusts. All around him, his magicians and his advisors are saying more and more, you need to listen to Moses. The whole land is going to be destroyed if you don't let the people go. But Pharaoh keeps refusing in his stubbornness. And finally, in chapter 12, the last and worst plague of all, fulfilling God's warning to Pharaoh. In chapter 12 and verse 29, it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home in where there was not someone dead. Now, you read in parallel accounts about this, that it was actually the angel of the Lord that went out into the land of Egypt and struck these people in this fashion. This is retribution. Pharaoh had a policy of throwing Hebrew male children into the Nile River to drown them. So the Lord responds by destroying the children of Egypt. The Lord said, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let him go, or I will kill your firstborn son. Well, Pharaoh didn't heed that warning. And so the Lord destroyed his firstborn son in retaliation. There was no household, it says, in which there was not someone dead, referring to families, not physical houses. And an event this tragic and dramatic for the Egyptians prompts the Exodus. They basically pay Israel to leave. Why? Because one angel of the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. Angels are pretty scary. Another passage in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 37. The book of Isaiah. And this is a segment of Isaiah that is actually parallel to a segment of 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapters 18, 19, and 20. But in Isaiah 36 and 37, the Assyrian Empire is starting to take over the world. They were a very powerful group of individuals. And as the Assyrian emperors, every time an Assyrian emperor died, the peoples would revolt against them. Whenever Shalmaneser died, all the people revolted against him. Whenever Sargon II died in battle, all the people revolted against him. And every time they revolted, the next Assyrian emperor turned out to be just as scary as his father had been and subjected all of the peoples of the ancient Near East to his rule. Well, a similar thing happened in the case of Sennacherib. At the death of Sargon, Hezekiah rebelled against the new ruler, Sennacherib, and Sennacherib turned out to be a pretty formidable foe. He conquered most of the Median and Babylonian regions in Mesopotamia, and then set his sights on Judea, on Hezekiah, the ringleader of the rebellion against him. And the Assyrians were brutal. They loved to conquer, they loved to deport people, and they loved to pillage people. They had a policy of taking people who were native inhabitants of a land and scattering them among the nations so that their entire sense of national identity was effectively destroyed. They had already destroyed the city of Samaria in northern Israel and deported most of the Israelites into captivity. Now they set their sights on Jerusalem. And in Isaiah chapter 36, Sennacherib decides to try a policy to sort of skip the siege part of Jerusalem. He sends one of his chief cupbearer, Rabshakeh, to go and taunt the Israelites. And Rabshakeh says all kinds of nasty things about Israel and about Hezekiah and about their God. Your God's not going to protect you. You might as well just give up and open the gates of the city and let us come in now. Because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to be stuck in that city and you'll be basically eating your own excrement. It was a very crude speech. Well, the end result of that, of course, and Isaiah goes to the prophet Isaiah to consult with him about this. Then Sennacherib sends Hezekiah a really nasty letter in Isaiah chapter 37 in verses 8 through 13. He says in verse 10, "Thus you shall say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, destroying them completely. So will you be spared? Did the gods of those nations which my fathers have destroyed and deliver them, even Gozan and Haran and Rezeph and the sons of Eden who were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath and the king of Arpad, and the king of the city of Sepharvaim, and of Hena and Eva? Where are all the other kings I conquered, Hezekiah? Oh, they're all gone. And where are their gods? Did their gods save them? No, they didn't. So what makes you think you're so special? What makes you think your God's going to save you? In both the speech of Rabshakeh and the letter of Sennacherib, the points are basically the same. That none of the other gods of the nations I conquered were able to save them, and therefore Yahweh can't save you from me. Sennacherib reasons inductively about past events and draws a prescriptive conclusion for the future. I've won every other battle, so I might as well win this one too. But Sennacherib has a flaw in his plan. His appeal to history fails to take into account the Lord of history. He fails to consider that, in fact, his battles were the product of divine intervention from above. He fails to consider the fact that, he might just now be facing off with the true God. As Isaiah warns elsewhere in his book, in chapter 10, the axe is not to boast over the one who wields it. Assyria is ultimately just a tool in the hands of the Almighty, and they will lose this battle. And Isaiah gives a rather lengthy speech in chapter 37. about all of the things that the Lord will do in response to this. But the main point comes in verses 36 through 38. Now, I want to say at this point, if you read Assyrian records, Sennacherib's invasion, Sennacherib's own record of his invasion of Israel claims this, that he went into Israel, he shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, he exacted a heavy tribute from him, and then he went home, having been satisfied with being bought off. That's all the Assyrian records say about that. Now that's fairly unusual for Assyrian policy, because the Assyrians were not in the habit of sparing people that revolted against them. It was extremely unusual, yea, unheard of, for the Assyrians to go into a kingdom that had revolted against them and spare the monarch, much less leave him on the throne, all because of a sum of money. The Assyrians were brutal, and they loved to punish disloyalty. So Sennacherib's record is kind of out of odds, out of character. Now, some historians think that it's still truthful. But the Bible tells a different story in verses 36 through 38. That the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, all of these were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And it came about as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adrammelech and Sharezer his sons killed him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon his son became king in his place. Now, who's telling the truth? Who has a legitimate motive not to record what actually happened? You know, the Bible actually tells us about Hezekiah's tribute to Sennacherib. You get that in 2 Kings chapter 18. Now, Isaiah doesn't mention it, but 2 Kings 18 does. But Sennacherib's annals don't mention the part about his army getting obliterated. So much so, there's actually a Greek historian named Herodotus who records the same event of his army again getting destroyed, although Herodotus attributes it to a plague of mice. What happened? Well, the Bible affirms that Hezekiah paid the tribute, and that the Assyrians said, well, we're going to destroy your city anyway, and then an angel stopped them. One angel of the Lord obliterated their army and prevented them from advancing any further on Jerusalem. The Assyrian overconfidence led to their annihilation. Now, which version of that story do you believe? There's no middle ground on this point. Either Isaiah is recording a fictitious history or the entirety of his theology falls apart. But Isaiah's entire point up till now has been the contention that Yahweh is the ruler of the nations, and he proves it by pointing to this event in which the Assyrians were stopped dead in their tracks. Now, the angel's not the point of that story. But the angel of the Lord was the instrument of destruction here. And of course, Sennacherib himself meets an untimely end. Granted, this is years later, but you'll note how Hezekiah goes into the house of his God twice in this story, and he finds salvation. Sennacherib goes into the house of his God and finds death. What about a third story? Let's go to the book of Daniel. You want to talk about books of the Bible of which have given people headaches, sections of the Bible that have given people headaches. The last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel have done just that. And the reason why is, well, because there's quite a lengthy prophetic discourse. It's a bizarre and a lengthy vision, most of it in conversation that he had with that angel we read about at the beginning in chapter 10. And virtually everything in these chapters is referring to something that takes place in the intertestamental period, the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And much of Daniel chapter 11 is this blow-by-blow account of a conflict between 2 of Alexander's Greek successors, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. In fact, the predictions that are made here are so ridiculously specific and detailed that almost every scholar who rejects the Bible is forced to claim that Daniel was written after the events in which he describes here. It is what is known as prophecy ex eventu, prophecy after the fact. Because otherwise, how could he have known about it? And if you don't believe the Bible, you have to conclude that Daniel was written after all of the events he describes, because they're too particular and too specific and exhibit far too much knowledge of the timeline of the Ptolemy-Seleucid conflict. Well, those of us who don't have a problem accepting that Daniel was written by the guy who it says it was written by at the time it says it was written, and there's more to it than that. Let's read. Well, We're not going to read all of chapter 11 because it's long. But let's just kind of summarize the story. In verse 2, Persia is in power, but Persia will have its last hurrah, and a mighty king will arise and conquer the earth, and defeat the Persians and basically take over everything. Clearly, Alexander the Great, in verse 3. When he dies, in verse 4, his kingdom will be divided up into 4 parts. That happened in 323 BC. Only 2 parts of the kingdom will be relevant to the story, though. The king of the south and the king of the north. And throughout Daniel 11, the king of the south and the king of the north refer to different monarchs, but they're referring to the same 2 sets of kingdoms. The north being the Seleucids of Syria, and the south being the Ptolemies of Egypt. They attempt a marriage alliance between themselves in 252 BC, as detailed by verse 6. In verse 7, Ptolemy III wages war to avenge Bernice because the marriage alliance didn't work out, and the woman wound up dead. In verse 8, they recapture their gods from the Persians. In verse 9, Seleucus II attacks Egypt unsuccessfully. It's not using their actual names here. I'm assigning names as we go throughout because of the correspondence here. In verse 10, Antiochus III, who was a Seleucid, mobilizes his forces, and Ptolemy IV defeats him in verse 11. Antiochus captures Gaza in verse 13. The Jews in Palestine revolted against the Ptolemies of Egypt because you keep thinking about it. Egypt is in the south, Syria is in the north. Who's caught in the middle? Israel. So naturally, what are they fighting over? They're fighting over Israel. And the Ptolemies had control of Israel to start, but the Seleucids in the north wanted to take it back, and so they fought for it. And since the Israelites didn't like their Egyptian masters very much, they said, maybe we'd side with the Seleucids better. So they sided with Antiochus III and allowed him to basically take over. Verse 18, in verse 15, Antiochus captures Sidon, a well-fortified city. In verse 17, Cleopatra is the marriage of Cleopatra and Ptolemy V, another attempt at a marriage alliance that ended badly. In verse 18, Antiochus III was defeated by the Romans, and he died robbing temples. In verse 19, his successor, Seleucus IV, had an uneventful reign, mentioned in verse 20. And then from verse 21 onwards, we're dealing with a king named Antiochus IV, better known to history as Antiochus Epiphanes. That's a name he gave for himself. It's really arrogant. Epiphanes means God made manifest, because Antiochus Epiphanes was really full of himself. Antiochus IV is described in verse 21 as a despicable person. To start with, in verse 22, he removed somebody called the Prince of the Covenant. That refers to his removal of the high priest Ananias from the temple in Jerusalem. And all of these, he begins to do quite a few terrible things. He invades Egypt. The Egyptian king is betrayed by his friends. He begins persecuting the Jews in verse 28. What wound up happening was he removed Ananias III from being priest and replaced him with a guy named Jason. And then he decided he didn't like Jason anymore. He removed him for Menelaus. And after he decided he didn't like Menelaus, he just started killing the Jewish high priests. Because I guess that's how business is done in the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus eventually, in verse 31, set up something called the Abomination of Desolation, which refers to a scene where he goes into the temple and sacrifices a pig's head on the altar to dedicate it for Zeus rather than Yahweh. Now this is all detailed in other extra-biblical literature like Maccabees and so on. It's a pretty scary event. This was the beginning of persecution. And persecution unlike any other, really. And it's the Jewish covenant, and the worship of Yahweh was outlawed. I just wanted to put this in perspective. The Holocaust, which took place in the last century, was a terrible atrocity that killed more people numbers-wise. But the persecution under Antiochus was the closest that the Jewish culture ever came to actually being obliterated from the face of the earth. Antiochus, he's the prototypical example of state-sponsored persecution. The language that is used to describe him in verse 36 is someone who exalts himself and magnifies himself above every god and speaks monstrous things against the God of gods. That language is used later in the New Testament to talk about the man of lawlessness. You want to talk about expressions like man of lawlessness and antichrist and the little horn of Daniel, all that. Antiochus was that before Jesus ever came to this earth. He was the persecutor. How do you stop a man like that? chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, and at the time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Now he doesn't even really talk about the devastation. He doesn't talk about how Antiochus' army is stopped. He doesn't talk about how Antiochus is going to die. It just mentions that he will, verse 45 of chapter 11, that he will come to his end and no one will help him. It doesn't describe a lot about the mechanisms. But all Daniel has to say is this one statement in chapter 12 and verse 1, that Michael, the great prince, will stand up. And do you really need to read any further? Because now you know how the story ends. Because if it only took one angel to destroy Pharaoh's firstborns, and it only took one angel to destroy Sennacherib's great army, it's only going to take one angel to stop Antiochus Epiphanes, a man who claimed he was God and tried to stamp out worshippers of the true God. There's no epic battle described here, just an assertion. He will meet his end and no one will help him. Now I realize there's some controversy over how these latter the end of chapter 11 and chapter 12 of Daniel are interpreted. Some people want to apply it to a different conflict, like with Rome or with something even further future than that. Maybe there's some application to be made there. That's a lesson for another day. But here, this clearly has application to the great enemy of God's people. Michael, the great angel, the great prince, stands up and protects the people. Only takes one angel to stop this. So what's the point of all this? Why am I telling you about these terrifying angels who are destroyers and who are protectors of God's people? Yes, destroyers of everyone else. Because I want to bring us to one final story that'll make the point for us. In Matthew chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26, Jesus is praying in the garden. He knows his time is coming. He's prayed to the Father, let this cup pass from me. But not what I will, but what you will. Jesus is clearly distraught over what's about to happen to him. And in verse 47, it says that while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and elders of the people. And he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him. Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi! And kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you've come for. And they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled which say it must happen in this way? Here he is, betrayed with a kiss, a sign of friendship, called Rabbi. One of Jesus' disciples decides to intervene with the sword. All four Gospels mention it. Only John tells us that it was Peter that did this. It's the classic misunderstanding of the nature of the kingdom. The disciples think that this is a kingdom that will be won by hard warfare and the edge of a sword. But Jesus has a different plan in mind. The kingdom of God is not about violent revolution. It's not about the overthrow of civil authorities. The church is not the vessel of political and social change. It is it is a group of people who are designed to build up one another and help others get to heaven. Jesus, though, says, you're missing the point. He says, we don't need your sword. I could summon 12 legions of angels if I wanted to. Now, think back to the stories we've been talking about here. It only took one angel to defeat Pharaoh of Egypt. It only took one angel to defeat Sennacherib of Assyria. It only takes one angel to put down Antiochus Epiphanes. Jesus isn't saying that he could summon one angel. He's saying he could summon 12 legions of angels, more than. We have a song in our songbook. I didn't really think to request it this morning, but it wouldn't have fit with the theme anyway. He could have called 10,000 angels. That song is underestimating the number, because if you know how much is in a Roman legion, you know that there's 6,000 soldiers in a legion. But he could have called 72,000 angels. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well, and musically speaking, as 10,000. Jesus could have summoned 72,000 angels. What do you think would have happened? The world would have been destroyed by the onslaught of heaven. That's what would have happened. Jesus doesn't go to the cross because his disciples were too weak to stop it from happening. He doesn't go to the cross because, oh no, I was just overpowered by the authorities. That's the wrong way to read that story. If you think Jesus going to the cross was an accident, or you think it was something done against his will, that's not what happens at all. It all comes back to the prayer in the garden. Not what I will, but what you will. Jesus was so determined to obey his Father and follow his will that he doesn't summon these angels. Jesus didn't view the situation in terms of what was best for him, of getting his way. Jesus viewed the situation in terms of the love he had for the lost human race. A race that did not love him in return. Now, just like all the other stories we've read, angels are not the point of the story. But boy, do they underscore it. Because let me tell you something. Jesus' capacity to summon that many angels doesn't stop with the garden. Later on, he's on trial in a kangaroo court of injustice, condemned by a world not fit to judge him. Jesus should have been the one condemning the world, but instead the world condemns him. Jesus could have summoned legions of angels, tens of thousands of angels at any point during those legal proceedings to put a stop to the matter. Oh, you can't find testimony against me. Here, let me help you out. Jesus could have summoned the angels in mass when they were making him carry his cross to Golgotha, and when they nailed him to his cross. And keep in mind, Jesus doesn't actually need to summon the angels either. He could have incinerated them himself. Why? Because he's the Son of God. He made the world. If he made the world, how fast can he unmake it? So why doesn't he? He's the selfless, sacrificial, suffering servant. He's our ultimate example. And when they nailed him to the cross, they mocked him. They mocked him. Come down from the cross. Save yourself, they say in 27 and verse 40. Oh, he saved others, but he can't save himself. Let him come down and then we'll believe. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he delights in him. They don't realize that they're quoting from Psalm 22. And if that were you on the cross and you were being killed for a crime that you had never committed, how would you react? If that were me on the cross and I was being killed for a crime I didn't commit, and they'd start taunting me, oh, come down from the cross since you're just so special and wonderful. I probably would have come up with some kind of verbal tongue lashing to give them. Imagine if I had the power of the Son of God at my disposal. Well, then I would have come down from the cross. Forget summoning the angels, I'll do it myself. Boom, you're all gone. That'll show you who's in charge. Jesus could have done it. What's holding him on the cross? It's not the nails. It's not like they had duct tape either. No! Jesus behaves as he did through the trial. Silent, does not open his mouth, does not revile in return, as 1 Peter chapter 2 puts it. It says that you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. While being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. You were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Could Jesus have come down from the cross? Absolutely. Could he have summoned the angels? Absolutely. But he does not. Why? Romans chapter 5 and verses 6 through 11. While we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, Though perhaps for the good man someone would dare even to die, but God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more, having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only this, but we also exult in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation. Amazing love. How can it be that you, my God, would die for me? How can it be indeed that such a thing would take place? So what's the point about angels in the Bible? Why are angels in the Bible? They're not the point of the story. But boy, oh boy, do they underscore the reality of what's going on here. That Jesus, with the might of heaven behind him, chooses not to use it, exercises restraint with all the power he has at his disposal. And he does it because his love outweighs that power, because his compassion for the human race outweighs his determination. His compassion for the human race outweighs his determination to get what's his. Now that's got huge implications for how we live and how we ought to imitate Jesus. In a culture that is so self-absorbed and self-obsessed with getting what's mine and getting my rights and standing up for myself, Jesus does everything the opposite. He does everything counterintuitive of the way we might think about it. So you ask, what are angels? Ask, what is the Lord that he would choose not to summon those angels? Who is he that he would do these things when the Lord has shown us who he is? So now that Christ has died for us, let's ask ourselves another question. Are we willing to die with him? Are we willing to walk the same path that he walked? Now take out your songbooks as we begin to conclude this lesson this morning. You see the extent that Jesus went to? He didn't have to do it. He didn't have to save us, but he chose to because he loved us. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether or not we will accept his offer of grace. How we live our lives says something about that. In Romans chapter 6, Paul says, what shall we say? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so we would no longer be slaves to sin, for he who has died is freed from sin. You want to be raised with Christ in the last day? You got to walk the path that he walked. You want to be conformed to his resurrection? You got to be conformed to his death. The scriptures talk about baptism as being part of that. It also talks about the need to not continue sinning just because it's an excuse for grace to abound. Whatever the situation may be, however you need to make your life right with the Lord, do not hesitate and do not make it something that you put off until tomorrow, because we are never guaranteed tomorrow. Make your life right with the Lord today and walk the path that he walked. All together we stand and we sing the song selected.